hard. Doing the right thing and standing up for the right thing is difficult. Discovering that someone isn't who you were expecting them to be is hard. Trying to be the person who you want to be is difficult. Following Jesus is hard. I think sometimes we like to imagine that as Christians, things will be easier, that it will be smooth sailing, that we will become successful and happy. But the truth is, it's hard. Robert Grates is now a retired Lutheran pastor at 90 years old. He served in Montgomery, Alabama, when he was 28. This was his first call out of seminary, and he was called to Trinity Lutheran Church, which was a primarily black congregation. So Pastor Grates and his wife Jeannie stood out a little, but they were welcomed and embraced wholeheartedly. Now, when Pastor Grates had been at seminary in Ohio, the civil rights movement was beginning, and he was very interested. He even joined the NAACP, but it wasn't until he got to Montgomery that he really experienced what was going on. He found that he couldn't get his hair cut by a black barber, and he couldn't eat in a black diner because it was forbidden by segregation laws. But Pastor Grace had read the Gospels, and he knew that following Jesus was hard. And he knew he was called to do the right thing. So naturally, he found a way and met with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Rosa Parks was his neighbor, just a few houses down. They were friends. And so he listened, and he learned, and of course, he and Jeannie supported the bus boycotts. And they got involved in the civil rights movement. So much so that as a result, some white supremacists were offended. And they became targets of harassment. And the Ku Klux Klan bombed their home multiple times. They didn't care that the Graces had 2 little girls and a 9-day-old son. They threw in their 11 sticks of dynamite and TNT. Now, solid charges, a strong case was made against 7 white men. But they were acquitted because, well, it was Montgomery. And white people who helped black people were more offensive to the Klan and Klan-type people than people of color themselves. Changing the world was going to be hard. Their safety was at risk. This was going to be a struggle. But the Grates family kept going because they had been called to follow Jesus. Now, following Jesus was also a struggle for many of the disciples. As we heard in the gospel today, some of Jesus' teachings were hard. They were difficult to understand and to accept. And they weren't at all what they had been expecting. I mean, many of the disciples got on board because they were waiting for Jesus to teach about how awful the Romans were. You know, the ones who had crossed the border into their land and shaken things up and seemed to take over and change their way of life. And many of the disciples were wondering when Jesus was going to preach about how nasty those Samaritans are. You know, the ones who have totally different values and traditions and worship God in such a different way that they weren't even certain it was the same God. And many were just flat out offended when Jesus identified himself as the bread of life. What does that even mean? Who does he think he is? And so they left. Because change is hard. Changing their minds was hard. Changing their expectations was hard. And they were offended. And Jesus didn't chastise them as they left. I think he continued to love them anyway. Sometimes I wonder if even for those of us who have grown up in the church, who have listened to the stories about Jesus and his teachings since we were little, as long as we can remember, if sometimes his teachings are hard for us too, if sometimes they're not exactly what we have been expecting. Because if we're honest, aren't there some times when we're sort of expecting for Jesus to teach and preach about how awful and nasty our supposed enemies are? And instead, he tells us to love our enemies? Really? And isn't it sometimes hard when Jesus tells us to love one another, everyone, our neighbors as ourselves, and to serve others? And sometimes I think maybe we can get offended at trying to practice what Jesus preaches about caring for the sick and feeding the hungry and welcoming and including everyone, because it's not always fair and it doesn't seem just and we're not sure that they deserve it. And it can be difficult when we realize that instead of Jesus judging those who we think are all messed up, maybe we're the ones getting judged for judging. Yeah. Change is hard. That's why most people don't do it. That's why so many of the disciples left. That's why so often I think we cover our ears when the Spirit is calling on us to reflect on how we should be changing. In our first lesson today, Joshua is giving the Israelites a chance, an opportunity to opt out. Because we're either all in or we're all out. And that can be kind of scary. Because we really can't follow God half-heartedly. Jesus doesn't call lackadaisical disciples. can be tempting. But if any of you here, if any of us, like Pastor Grace, like those 12 disciples who stuck around, feel the Spirit stirring, can you feel it? We're not in this alone. Between the belt of truth and the shield of faith and the helmet of salvation and all those other fancy armor parts, the Spirit is upon us. Through all of our hard ways, through everything that we encounter. And through those encounters, we may realize that grace really is amazing. And it really is for everyone. And we have encounters where we find that it is an honor and privilege to serve the least of these and to risk our own peace for the peace and justice of others. And we realize that you just can't be apathetic about God. It doesn't work. And as we realize all this, we find that these teachings may be hard. And from time to time, we may be offended that we're asked to change. And change, it's difficult. But it's worth it. Because Jesus, the Christ, the bread of life, promises to feed us. He is with us always, everywhere. He does not turn his back on us. And he calls us to do the hard thing and go the hard way because he has done the hardest things for us. So I ask you, where is the Spirit calling you to go? How is God asking you to change yourself and the world? You are witnesses to the good news that Jesus has the words of eternal life. Where else can we go? Are you in or are you out? Come, put your armor on, and be fed.